Yeah, so my name's Adam Camo, and I'm a Slocum Glider user out of Dalhousie University in Canada, and we fly gliders. These are autonomous submarines that profile the water column collecting data, and we're funded by the Ocean Tracking Network, MEOPAR, which is the Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction, and Response Network. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we've been doing for the last few years. So we've been flying gliders for the last 7 years off of Nova Scotia, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and a couple of missions off of Vancouver. And we've flown about 60-odd missions and averaged about 200 glider days at sea per year. And in the early days, we've had 2 gliders that we were doing this with, and recently we're up to 6 now. We load our Slocum gliders with all kinds of science sensors, whether it's CTDs, passive hydrophones, echo sounders, fluorometers, scatterometers, oxygen sensors, acoustic receivers and transmitters. We put all kinds of different sensors on our Slocum gliders depending on what kind of data the scientists want to collect. In the early 2000s, we were focused a lot of our missions were focused on running the Halifax line. If you can see in the corner over there, that red box off of Nova Scotia, that's a 200-kilometer line that runs perpendicular to Nova Scotia, and that's where we focused most of our efforts. And the reason for that was because the Ocean Tracking Network has this line of bottom-mounted acoustic receivers. These acoustic receivers, seen here on the bottom, will detect any electronically tagged animal that passes by it. And these receivers were placed along this Halifax line for 200 kilometers, essentially making an electronic curtain that would detect any animal that passes by it. And they bought some Slocum gliders so that they could be used to provide environmental context to why these animals are moving in certain places of this line, to provide information to help explain movement. One researcher has used the Slocum glider data along with detection data to explain to try to help explain where and why the salmon migrate along Nova Scotia like they do. Salmon that go in rivers in the US often migrate along Nova Scotia. And in these graphs here, the data go from basically near shore to offshore. And you can see in that top panel, the lines are higher. And that just means there's more salmon detections at the beginning of the line closer to shore than offshore. And Matt DeVere et al. Did some research to try to explain what the oceanographic conditions were at this beginning of the line. And they found out that the salmon prefer colder and fresh water and have absolutely no preference to what the currents are doing. So a lot of the time they're going head into the Scotian current, which runs along Nova Scotia, but they don't seem to mind. This is just a highlighted section of what I was talking about. Other researchers have used the Slocum glider data to look at climatology and hydrography on this line as well. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada has got research vessels that monitor these stations along those lines there. In the bottom corner, you can see the HL1, 2, 3, and 4. And they monitor these stations a few times a year with oceanographic cruise ships. And they've been doing so for the last 19 years. And we've been collaborating with them, and every time we run our Slocum glider through the Halifax line, we get a map that looks like this. In the upper panel, it's temperature, and again, the data go from near shore to offshore. And you can see these dotted lines. You can see these dotted lines showing the location of where DFO samples. So by collaborating and sharing the Slocum glider data with DFO, you can get this unprecedented spatial coverage of water temperature and understand new features that would have been otherwise missed. Again, Matt DeVere, he used the Slocum glider data to determine ocean currents, and this is without any kind of current meter on the glider. And the way he did this was he used glider-derived density, which are the black isolines that you see, combined with glider drift. So when the glider goes underwater, it's subject to the ocean currents, and then when it comes up, it can get an estimate of how far it's been pushed. So it used a combination of these isolines, isopycnal lines, and glider drift to determine the geostrophic flow that runs along Nova Scotia. And he validated this data with bottom-mounted ADCPs that were located at different sites, and the data match up pretty well. I won't go into the details, but I've put a reference to his paper, and you can come and see me afterwards for it. And just to show you, to explain a little bit, the blue section of this figure corresponds to currents going in the southwest direction, so along Nova Scotia. That represents the Scotian current, and the green data points are just kind of very slow currents. Other researchers have examined the chlorophyll dynamics off the Scotian Shelf. Being in the Northwest Atlantic, where we've got the spring bloom that happens every spring, and you can see in this figure here, and again, almost all the figures I'm going to show you, it's always near shore to offshore, and you can see that the orange data are higher phytoplankton concentration, and we've captured the spring bloom over several years, and we can develop climatologies to kind of predict what's going to happen or to further study variations. And in the summer, after the spring bloom kind of happens, it usually dies off because the phytoplankton ran out of nutrients. And in the summer, where you can see in that plot over there, the phytoplankton kind of die down into this subsurface chlorophyll maximum, they call it. And the researchers have found that this layer is, although much lower in phytoplankton concentration than during the spring bloom, if you take the integrated chlorophyll concentration of this area, it represents a significant concentration of phytoplankton that would have otherwise been missed because one of the ways that researchers study phytoplankton in a broad scale is they use satellites. The satellites can look at the sea surface color to estimate chlorophyll concentration, but they can only estimate it in the upper few meters of the water column. So having this Slocum glider measure what's inside the water column and capture these layers that are hidden by the satellites are important to understand primary production on the Scotian Shelf. Other researchers have used a few different sensors combined together to help improve chlorophyll efflorescence algorithm. So some of you may or may not know phytoplankton, which are primary producers in our water. They're very important to the oxygen that we breathe. They're measured by their chlorophyll content because chlorophyll fluoresces, and fluorometers that are bought relatively cheaply can be put on Slocum gliders to measure fluorescence. But in order to do that, you need to know the measurements that come out of your fluorometer counts, and you need to convert them to chlorophyll concentration. And the factories will present this conversion factor as a static value, but in fact it changes depending on species composition of phytoplankton and environmental factors. So a grad student, Matt Beck, has looked at this data in relation to CDOM concentration and other factors to determine this coefficient, this conversion factor, while the glider's at sea, where it can't be validated by traditional means, and has plotted variations with time of this conversion factor. Recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've been putting hydrophones on our Slocum gliders and flying it in the southwest Nova Scotia, the smaller circle over there, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the bigger one, and even a couple of missions off of Vancouver Island, right here. And the hydrophone that we put on our glider is called a DMON, a digital acoustic monitoring instrument developed by Mark Baumgartner at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And this DMON is capable of classifying whale songs in real time and detecting whether or not it's heard a humpback, North Atlantic right whale, fin whale, or a sei whale. And here's just a map to show that where we've heard whales relative to where the Slocum Gliders have been. The one important region for the North Atlantic right whales, which is an endangered species, is off of southwest Nova Scotia in kind of this region here. And there's a zone highlighted in this box here where researchers have designated this a critical habitat for the right whales and have even altered fishing lanes to go, shipping lanes to go around it so to prevent whale strikes. And we've been flying our gliders in this region for the last few years to try to find out in what regions of this basin do the whales prefer. And then the next question was, well, why do they prefer these regions? So we've put an echo sounder on our glider and flown these transects back and forth through the basin to essentially get a map of whale prey. And whale prey it's kind of like little tiny shrimp, or zooplankton. And so you can get maps of this, and you can see some interesting features when you look at the data a little closer. For instance, this graph here shows zooplankton concentration at night, and the yellow is higher concentration and the blue is less, and also in the day. And you can see that there's more uniform concentration during the day, and there's more structure that happens, more structure that happens in the day and more uniform concentration at night. Now, the right whales have had quite a hard year this year. Like I said, they're an endangered species. There's about 500 of them left in the entire world, and 11 of them have died in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And we use the Slocum glider in addition to other survey methods, such as aerial surveys and ship surveys, to find maps of where these whales are, what part of the Gulf of St. Lawrence that they occupy, and where they're not. And this information has been sent to government officials and the shipping industry to alter vessel traffic through these regions where the whales frequent more often. And they've even reduced the length of time that the crab fishing season happens, because these whales were some of these whales have been killed by ship strikes, and some of them have been killed by getting caught in fishing gear. The end goal of the whale project, it's a MEOPAR funded project, is to develop a real-time notification system where you have Slocum gliders monitoring whales, looking for whales, and when they surface, they report the data in real time, and then that information gets transmitted to the shipping industry or the fishing industry via AIS or NAVTEX to help prevent further whale strikes. Of course, we've had a few problems over the years. Not everything's been good. In this year in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, there was the biggest salinity anomaly in the last 40 years. And we've only realized this right after we put our glider in the water. And our glider had a really hard time coming up to the surface. And in this region here, in the box that I've highlighted, that line that's going up should just keep on going straight up, but it kind of flattened out at 15 meters or so and remained at that depth for quite a while until the glider slowly warmed up and brought itself to the surface. But we went out and we removed some weight from the glider and then deployed it again, and we were fine until we realized that our glider was too light to make it deep into the water column, so we were stuck in the upper 50 meters. These big density ranges are a bit of a problem, especially when you have big salinity anomalies like we had this year. we've had lots of currents. This is supposed to be a straight line down and then back out. But as you can see, we've started doing these loops. We've ran into eddies. And being close to the Gulf of Maine, which is influenced by the Bay of Fundy tidal currents, we have a lot of tidal currents involved. So having different kinds of currents that all overlap on top of each other make it hard to find out what your glider is doing and why it's doing it. But for the most part, our glider works its way out of these currents as long as we're not in too much of a hurry.
What are the red arrows now?
Oh, sorry. The red arrows are stronger currents. The green arrows are slower currents. And glider noise, so the DMON, our hydrophone that can classify different types of whales, relies on an algorithm that compares the whale songs over the background noise. So if your glider makes noise, it's going to raise the background noise and you're going to have a harder time to classify the whales because the signal to noise ratio gets screwy. So one thing that we found to minimize glider noise is change the fin settings. So in this middle panel up here, you can see that the fin is always going back and forth on the glider to maintain a constant heading. And these are in radians. And in this situation, the fin is making too much noise for our classifying algorithm to work properly. So we've changed some fin settings and had it move less frequently, but to these discrete intervals. And we significantly improved the ability for the DMON to classify whale sounds. We've got our glider kind of zigzags around a little bit more because the fin's moving less. It's kind of goes throughout the water like that, which slows it down a little bit, but we still get to go to where we want to go. But despite all these issues that we've ran into, the Slocum Glider is really adaptable, and we've found ways to always come through these problems. And we've succeeded in measuring and doing research with ocean physics and chemistry, phytoplankton concentration, zooplankton concentration, and we've even helped save the whales. Thank you.
Teledyne Marine. Everywhere you look.